Don, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No problem.
Our audience, we're joined by Professor Don Fallis from Northeastern. So, Don, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
I'm a professor of philosophy and computer science at Northeastern University. I specialize in what's called social epistemology. That is, I study how people acquire knowledge, and in particular, I study how people acquire knowledge in a social context. And so I've done a lot of investigations on how we can improve the information environment in such a way that people will be better able to learn what they want to learn about the world.
Yeah, excellent. And you've written a lot about problems we face today, disinformation, solutions like Wikipedia. But I actually today was hoping to talk about a paper that you wrote that's quite influential, and you wrote it a long time ago in 2004, and you argued that you predicted that there's this big problem with verifying information on the internet, and you argued we need a systematic way to do this. We have to define the right way to do it, and perhaps more importantly, agree as a society how we will agree information's verified, and then you suggest that we can learn from philosophers in the past, particularly David Hume, to get some insights. And this is quite different than people who have been arguing that this is really an ethical problem, or we can build some magical artificial intelligence, a true-false detector. You really emphasized the epistemology of testimony and how to verify information. So this is a lot of what AverPoint thinks about, and you've been thinking about it for a long time. So we're very glad to have you. So today what I was hoping to do for the audience was maybe start with some definitions for folks who aren't as familiar with some of these terms, then go into your paper from 2004 that proposed this epistemology, and then third, end with some applications of this to today's internet and some challenges we face today. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, so maybe with some definitions, for the audience that's not as familiar, could you just help us understand this very complicated word, epistemology?
Yeah, so epistemology comes from the Greek and literally means the study of knowledge. And there's a lot of investigation in, this is one of the main areas that philosophers study. There's metaphysics, there's ethics, and there's epistemology. And so what epistemologists do is, first of all, like any philosopher, they try and get clear on what their terms are. So there's a lot of discussion about exactly what knowledge is, trying to give a conceptual analysis. But there's also a big part of epistemology is, given that knowledge is something that all of us would like to have, and in order to get through our lives, need to have. How can we go about getting it? And so that's what epistemologists are on about, is like, how can I acquire knowledge about the world?
Yeah, and then the other term that we all use, but I think it needs some definition for this conversation, is testimony. It's an old concept, but can you kind of define it and how we'll be using it in today's conversation?
Yeah, so the one way in which philosophers will kind of divide up the project of epistemology is looking at different, quote, sources of knowledge, different things that can, provide us with information about the world. And the first thing that a lot of philosophers will look at is perception, that your five senses tell you stuff about the world. Like I see right now there's a tree outside my window, and that's just information that I've got from my perceptual system. But another source of knowledge that we have about the world is other people, and we often learn things about what's going on in the world, and in particular what's going on in the world in far-flung places and often far-flung times, from what other people tell us, because they've been there and we haven't. And so when somebody tells me that it's, hot outside, and I form the belief that, oh, it's going to be hot, I don't want to wear a coat today, or somebody tells me it's raining outside, I better bring my umbrella, then my source of information is what this other person tells me. And just like we have to worry in the case of perception, under what circumstances should I trust the information, that I'm getting, that, there's not it's not like this object is actually red, rather than it being something under a red light that just looks red. I also have to worry about, if somebody tells me something like it's raining, is it actually raining, or is this person mistaken, or does this person have a motivation for deceiving me? So essentially, testimony is one possible source of knowledge, and depending on the type of source of knowledge, there'll be different sort of rules for determining whether you can trust that source.
Yeah, and so, I think the way you frame this in the paper, really strikes me, is that in today's world, it's a global world. We get a lot of knowledge from different places. There's a record that goes back to ancient times. There's a lot of knowledge we get from past times, and knowledge itself is very specialized. So I might be looking at an open heart surgery, but I may not be able to interpret it if I'm not trained to understand it. And so for a variety of reasons, I have to rely on other people. So you asked this question, well, what is a systematic way to know if I can trust all this information that I have access to through the internet? And then you ended up focusing on Hume. So for those of us that are less familiar, could you help us understand who Hume was and how to put in context of kind of the broader lineage of ideas?
So Hume is a Scottish philosopher from the 17th century. So sort of early Enlightenment philosopher. And he was one of the things that Hume was realizing was the sorts of things that you were just mentioning about, like that, we live in this global world where we can get all sorts of information from other people, that we often have to rely on what philosophers call a division of cognitive labor, that different people have different specialties. We can't all be experts in everything. And so earlier philosophers tended to be kind of hyper individualistic, and like, we're gonna like figure this all out from first principles, all in our lonesome. But Hume realized that that's just not feasible. We have to rely on other people in order to acquire the pieces of knowledge that we really need to get through our lives. But this reliance on other people sort of opens you up to, you become vulnerable to being misled in ways that you might not have been vulnerable to if you were sort of working it out all by yourself. And so Hume is actually one of the first philosophers to really discuss the importance of testimony, but also to sort of grapple with that problem of how do I know when I can trust, testimony? Because we've all met plenty of incompetent people in our lives, and we all met plenty of people that tried to deceive us. And so, how do we make sure that this person that's telling me it's raining outside is not one of those people?
Right. So then maybe we could transition into the paper you wrote, where you kind of said we learn from Hume, and one of the first people to think about this, and he pushed us to consider a systematic way to evaluate testimony. And so I was hoping maybe for this section we could talk through, you divided it into 4 parts, so we could talk through each of those, and you could help us understand what Hume was saying, how you think this applies to the internet, and maybe if you have some further updates since you first proposed the theory.
Okay.
So maybe starting with the first section, or maybe let me listing this for the audience. So you listed the four parts of your epistemology of testimony: authority, corroboration independently, the plausibility and support of the idea, and finally the presentation of the idea. So maybe starting with authority, who is testifying? Do you want to talk us through that and how we can evaluate that?
Okay, so well, I suppose I should mention that the ideas that I'm taking from Hume here are actually largely from this famous chapter of his inquiry, and the chapter is called "Of Miracles," and it's all about people claiming that, you know, a miracle has occurred, you know, somebody has risen from the dead, or, you know, somebody has walked on water. And Hume sort of famously argued that we probably shouldn't trust testimony that, you know, it says that, you know, a miracle has occurred. And I won't go into the details of why he says that, but the important thing is that in terms of giving an analysis of when you can trust reports of miracles, he actually runs through a sort of well thought out general epistemology of testimony as to what are the rules for deciding whether you trust what somebody else tells you. And as you say, I was sort of emphasizing sort of four components that he talks about. And the first component that you mentioned is what you might call the authority of the source. You know, does this person know whereof they speak? So, and in order to answer that question, you can consider, you know, if this person is making a, you know, scientific claim that such and such COVID vaccine is effective, do they have scientific qualifications? You can also consider, does this person have a good track record for, you know, telling the truth and or making accurate claims on this particular subject matter? And another important issue is, does this person have any sort of bias that might lead them to fail to inform me of useful information or actually try to mislead me?
Yeah, conflict of interest. So they could be an expert, but they have some conflict that may shape what they end up using their expertise to say.
Right.
And so that's the authority section. Before we move on, is there anything since you proposed that, you know, as a key metric you've seen in the internet that's interesting, where authority has either been misused or not used or overused, that jumps to mind?
Well, the sort of one of the difficulties with one of the particular difficulties with the internet is that it can be difficult to pin down exactly who you're talking to, and unless you can figure out who it is you're talking to, then it's hard to perform these tasks of, does this guy have a good track record? Do they have qualifications? And also, you know, maybe the website the website or the social media post claims that they have qualifications. How do I know that that's true? And so you run into these sort of difficulties of sort of pinning down, you know, who you're actually dealing with on the internet, that, you know, maybe in the, you know, earlier years, maybe in the Hume's time, you know, if you're getting testimony, you're either getting it face to face or from a book, and that's about it. And, you know, there's sort of limitations on how information can flow, and it's a little bit easier to pin down who you're talking to or who you're getting information from and whether they know what they're talking about. So it's not that Hume's principle of check the authority of the source isn't still perfectly appropriate today. It's just that technology has the potential to change the the situation in such a way that you have to use different techniques and different tools to answer that question of, do they have the authority to speak on this topic?
Right. Do they have the authority, as well as the other point you mentioned, do they have a reason to be biased? And technology is a way to both exacerbate that problem, but also there are ways to solve it that are fairly creative, that would have been harder to do, I think, in the 20th century. Okay, so authority. Then the second piece was independent corroboration. So could you talk us through what that is and some of the nuances of that?
Yeah. Again, to go back to Hume, he says, so if somebody says that a miracle occurred, the one thing that you might check is to say, well, what did anybody else witness this? Are there any other reports that might confirm or disconfirm what that person said? And the idea being that it's much less likely for 10 people to get it wrong than for one person, to get it wrong. But as you say, there's a sort of a proviso there of that the corroboration needs to be independent, because I suppose to use it to cite another philosopher is that if I was worried about the report, a report that I read in the newspaper today, I wouldn't buy another copy of that paper to check to see whether or not the claim was true, because that would not be independent corroboration. If it's just a bunch of people that are all on the same page colluding or whatever, then you don't have independent corroboration, and it's not so strange that they'd all report the same thing and all be wrong. So that's sort of a standard strategy that we still use today, that if something that we read on the internet doesn't strike us as clearly the case, then would check to say, well, is anybody else reporting that Justin Timberlake has just died? And you check other websites. But again, you have this sort of issue of how is the technology affecting how we should go about checking for confirmation or disconfirmation. And you do have to worry about that. Other sites might just be copying the first site because that gets them more clicks and generates more revenue for them, and they're not actually an independent source. So again, nothing wrong with Hume's strategy there. It's just that the technology may have made it a little more difficult to ensure that we've actually succeeded in getting independent corroboration.
Right. No, I've seen this where you'd see a fact and you could actually list 5 prestigious logos that are look like are all saying the same thing, and then as you write in your paper, they all got the information from the same original article. So that is actually N is still 1 in that case. And then there's a related issue of this is kind of groupthink or kind of herd mentality of ideas. So even if there are 5 people witnessing the same thing, they kind of convince each other that it's the same reality instead of using 5 different filters and criteria. So is that something that you see, with today's internet, likes and shares, as kind of exacerbating that phenomenon?
Yeah, I sort of like, I like to talk about that in the context of information cascades, that somebody says one thing and then somebody else comes along and they're not quite sure, but this guy says it, so I'll say it, and then the third person comes along and now there's two people saying it, and so we're off to the races, and all of a sudden there's it seems like everybody's agrees on this, when in fact it was just the first person got it wrong and everybody else just ignored their own personal information. Yeah, so I think that's always that's one of the risks in terms of trying to establish that you actually have independent corroboration, that the sources of the information are not getting their information from each other. I mean, in some sense, this is the respect in which the internet is just subject to the same sort of phenomenon, but given the speed and size, it can get to a point where it's really a serious problem in a way that maybe it wasn't if all of our interactions were face to face. I mean, basically the term something going viral is just sort of a way of expressing how information cascades can blow up given the size and scope of the internet. So again, it's a way in which the technology can make applying Hume's rules a little more difficult than they were for Hume himself.
Right. Yeah, and I think because these issues, they start to blend together. I think the key thing that you emphasize that I think really stood out is like the independence of the corroboration, which I don't think product people put enough weight on. When we're developing products, if we see a lot of people using something or if a behavior's starting to happen, that's good. That's typically good. We don't really have a way to weight the independence of those actions. Because as you said, virality is typically good in a product. You're getting a market signal. So we see this when we have an interface for a community to review a piece of information. There is a first mover advantage where somebody who makes the first move can kind of influence the rest. But okay, so that was the second piece. So then moving along to plausibility and support, which I think, as you say in your paper, I mean, engineers, scientific people would hope this is the main reason information is believed. But can you just talk us through that?
Yeah. So, well, I sort of, in some sense, lumped those two things together, plausibility and support, because they're factors that just have to do with the information itself. You're not checking who gave it to you. You're not checking who else might be saying the same thing. You're just looking at what they presented you with. And so one thing that you can look at is, does this make sense? Is this at all likely to be the case? And I mean, for a lot of the sort of current conspiracy theories, you sort of have to think that maybe the people that are buying into this didn't ask that question. Does this seem at all plausible that such and such cures COVID and nobody knows about this? So we all have a lot of background knowledge about the world, and we just need to apply that to the testimony that we get to see whether or not it passes the smell test, as they say. But then, in addition, often when we get information from other people, we don't just get, well, sometimes we do. Sometimes we do just get the claim. My friend comes in and says, it's raining outside, da, 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 da. and I just have to like decide to trust them or not trust them. But often when people provide us with testimony, they'll provide some sort of reason to support that. They'll present us with evidence or other things to check to support that what they're saying is actually the case. And there's sort of general rules of critical thinking for like evaluating evidence in general. Like, does this particular evidence that somebody's offering actually support the claim that they want to make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's very built into our interface, which what we're trying to do is at a UX level, make it very easy to see the support for a claim, which will then hopefully encourage you to think about the plausibility, even if you're not yourself an expert on it. And plausibility, as you said, it really does. There is a resonance with whatever mental model is in your head and has been shaped over your lifetime. But the support, a lot of times, is hard to see on the internet when things are moving fast. So that's a lot of what we're trying to symbolize, quantify, give shortcuts. And then if someone wants to dig deeper, they could see it in a way that's also hopefully a little friendlier and easier to evaluate than a huge list of footnotes at the back of the page or the back of the book.
Right. I just to interject something here. What I was sort of envisioning was the support that the person that offered the testimony gives to as to why you should believe what they're saying. But it's certainly the case that evidence for and against is useful in evaluating that testimony wherever you get it, whether you get it from the testifier or whether you get it from third parties, your social media peers and so forth. And so, like you say, the project that your organization has of sort of hooking people up to those sorts of sources is definitely helpful in evaluating testimony.
Great. So, and then the final piece of this is the presentation, which we often don't think about probably at the same level as the first three. But could you talk through what you meant there?
Yeah. Well, the idea that I think Hume was talking about in his discussion of miracles was, it's like, does this person seem confident? Does this person seem overconfident? How are they? This sort of like kind of clues that someone's lying or doesn't know what they're talking about, that we've all seen on cop shows, but that's just one sort of aspect of the way in which information might be presented. And when we're getting information on the internet, sometimes it's a video of somebody talking to us, like this one, but often it's text, and you might have to look for sort of different sort of clues to figure out, does that presentation of that material suggest that this source is to be trusted? And that ends up, again, because of the technology, it ends up being rather tricky to figure out what things are actually tied to testimony being accurate. That I did a bunch of studies back in the day about how you could, what sorts of clues on a website might be good for telling whether or not that website's likely to have accurate information. And turns out to be rather tricky to identify such things.
Yeah, and it's very easy to fake those. Like as soon as an AI machine figures that out, it's actually quite easy for this cat and mouse game for the disinformants to then fake that. And then deep fakes come up, and then you keep the ball keeps being moved there. But I was going to say that what the kind of getting better at understanding who's lying, who's not lying, as critical thinkers is certainly part of it. And the other part of this that we've spent a lot of time thinking about is that the elements of testimony are quite cognitively intense. And it's hard to look at footnotes. It's hard to really think critically. It's a lot easier to just kind of roll with a speech, a video, kind of follow a narrative, let your emotions go up and down. And a lot of what we're trying to figure out is the UX. So when I think about presentation of the information, it's like, can we make the UX of things that are harder to fake, your evidence, how other people have verified it, reviewed it, can we make that presentation easy for the mind to understand, as opposed to like, kind of, oh, there's a, I recognize there are footnotes, but I don't want to read them, which is a kind of a common reaction a lot of people have. But okay, so these were the four elements of your epistemology of testimony. So maybe now we could shift to the last section here, which is kind of putting this into practice. As I was just kind of starting to allude to, the internet is spreading information instantly. So some of the problems we deal with a lot, we've kind of summarized it in three parts, which is there are analytics that can trigger our amygdala. They can hijack our cognitive brain, kind of make us less rational and more fight or flight, more emotional. There are kind of related to that, we can message what people want to hear, what they want to believe. And so if you send a false message that people want to hear, or you associate a false message with something people want to hear, like they like cheeseburgers, you put your message next to a cheeseburger, it's very easy to get someone to believe something. And then, of course, tribal identity, and politics have gotten so tribal, and a lot of issues that weren't politicized have become politicized. Once you associate tribal identity with a piece of information, it's very easy to get someone to believe something, and not look at it in this four-part critical way. So these are psychological realities that we're trying to counter with our interface, our community. So I wanted to ask, is there anything we can learn from Hume or other philosophers about how you get humans who have these psychological realities to want to verify information? Like, how do you make that an urge that is kind of built into someone, and maybe overcome some of these other vulnerabilities?
Okay. Well, a lot of the work in epistemology and philosophy is also, philosophers are also big promoters of, quote, critical thinking. How do I, evaluate arguments to make a good determination about what I should believe. So philosophers have tended to focus on this issue of training up the individual who wants to acquire knowledge so that they'll have the right skills and abilities to, make that determination of whether I should believe such and such testimony. But recently, a number of philosophers have sort of developed, various versions of the idea that we're living in this information environment with all these other people sending messages around, and there's a structure to it. There's a structure to the information environment, and that structure has an impact on what any of the individual agents are able to do in terms of acquiring knowledge. And you can have an effect on people's ability to acquire knowledge by making changes to the environment, to that infrastructure, as well as by making, I mean, nobody's saying stop teaching people how to be critical thinkers. It's just that there's other stuff that can be done if our goal is to bring about the result that people are able to acquire knowledge about the world. And I think that a number of the things that you were mentioning about, targeting people with information that they want to hear, that trying to engender certain sorts of echo chambers where people are distrustful of the people on the other side, that those are all ways in which certain agents, certain organizations, certain institutions are adjusting the infrastructure in ways that get people to be more likely to believe what it serves their interests for people to believe. The sort of thing that I was pushing in the last part of of this paper, where I say, okay, here's what Hume said you should do. In the last half of that, I say, but what can those of us that are in the information mediation industry, so to speak, what can we do to change the infrastructure or modify the infrastructure so that it's easier for you to deploy those skills that Hume talked about, that makes it easier for you to,
Right.
do your due diligence. So, I mean, the one thing that I started worrying about was like, people just don't have enough time in their day
Mm-hmm.
to do all those 4 things that Hume was suggesting about every message they get. So there's just sort of this, limited time. And so what can we do so that it's easier for you? But then there's the issues that you're bringing up of, there's all sorts of people out there that have an interest in you believing thus and so, whether or not it's correct. And so what can we do to change the infrastructure to make it less easy for those bad actors to, manipulate the system?
Right. Yeah, there are a few. There's a number of insights I think in your answer. One of them is it's kind of the costs and benefits of verifying information in a systematic way. And I mean, the costs are time. The costs are it's cognitively difficult. The costs are it may require some prior training and some prior learning. And then the benefits are great too. And I mean, you kind of laid out some of those costs and benefits in your paper. I think as we think about it through our particular specific lens, we're really trying to make it easy, pleasant, desirable, fun, valuable to your reputation as a person in your industry, your content area, be it healthcare, be it national security, but really make the benefits of verifying your information high and the cost of it very low. It's going to be easy. It'll meet you where you are, whatever platform you're on, whatever type of content you want. And then I think, so that is one way where I think there's a lot of resonance there. And I think there's some hope there that it's not just that it's not that people don't want it, it's that people want it to be easier and less time consuming. And then I think maybe the last part of what you said relates to maybe the last question here, which is we're living at a time when experts have lost the authority they may have had in prior generations, and some of that is self-inflicted. There's been some scandals in different sectors, and there's been some self-dealing, and some of that is just the age. The internet has opened up information. Demagogues have arisen, attacked experts. Is there a path you see forward from what you've seen in epistemology and social epistemology that really, we could kind of leave with as a beacon of hope as we look for ways to increase trust in expertise and good knowledge?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think the thing that strikes me is that there's that I mean, it may be that people need, some degree of incentivizing to, check information and verify information. But it strikes me that most people, most of the time, are what you might call rational actors, that they do want to believe the truth, and they do have some sort of awareness of here's the sort of thing that you would do to check that. I mean, there's this sort of rhetoric of like, we live in the world, post-truth world, and we live in the world of alternative facts, and everybody just believes whatever it serves their interest to believe. And I don't really think people operate that way. But where we run into difficulties is that we don't have a good agreement on who's the source that I should listen to on such and such a subject. And if there's, just to play it out abstractly, if there's person A saying one thing and person B saying something else, and person A says, don't listen to person B, and person B says, don't listen to person A, and then you end up with, people who are, may very well be trying to figure out what the facts are and be good critical thinkers and evaluate them, ending up in very different places because the sources that they're trusting, are very different. And that's sort of a tricky issue I don't have a good solution to that one as to how we can get over the fact that we may disagree because we disagree about which sources of testimony to trust.
Yeah. Could you maybe make the point you made about John Locke and the instructive value of just doing your own research, and how maybe if experts can make it easier for people to learn it themselves, we might kind of bridge some of the gap?
One of the philosophers that influenced David Hume was John Locke, and he had this idea of the importance of epistemic autonomy, of getting to whatever it is that you end up believing on your own bat, rather than just trusting what other people say. Now, there's debate amongst epistemologists as to whether or not this notion of epistemic autonomy has sort of intrinsic value, that the knowledge you have is better because you figured it out for yourself, as opposed to just listening to what somebody else said. But certainly, if you're like in a kind of not completely safe information environment, which seems to be our current situation, then any sort of what you might call blind trust strategies, which might have worked, back in the mid 20th century, where you could, turn on the TV and listen to what Walter Cronkite said and trust what he says, and most of the time you wouldn't go too wrong. Now there's so many sources saying so many different things that probably you do need to have some sort of personal engagement, at least on those questions that are of importance to you, to deploy your own decision making, your own critical thinking skills to decide what you ought to believe.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great way to maybe wrap up the conversation, that there is a loss of trust in experts, for some legitimate reasons, many illegitimate reasons. But I think if experts adapt and make their expertise verifiable, checkable, and maybe are willing to kind of, in this 21st century landscape, make their expertise something that some of the skeptics can understand and believe and on their own get to. That might be all it takes, and that's something that we're certainly trying to make easier for people to do. So, well, with that, let me just kind of wrap up and say, we're very happy to have you spend some time with us. And you predicted this almost 20 years ago, and a lot of your ideas and frameworks have influenced a lot of the different solutions today. So thank you for being with us. We hope we can continue exchanging ideas with you, and we hope our audience, got to hear from an expert on David Hume and broadly epistemology, how our society can hopefully know good information again.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And